June 12, 1886. A carriage climbs through darkness toward a castle that shouldn't exist. Neuschwanstein. The name means new swan stone. It rises from a Bavarian cliff like something pulled from a fever dream. Towers pierce the night sky. Limestone walls glow pale against the alpine forest. The building looks medieval, ancient, as if knights might ride out at dawn. It is barely 17 years old. Inside the carriage sits a commission of doctors and government officials. They carry documents declaring that King Ludwig II of Bavaria is insane, unfit to rule, a danger to himself and the kingdom's finances. They have come to arrest him in his own fantasy. The castle gates open. The men step into the lower courtyard, their footsteps echoing off stone walls. Above them, in rooms filled with painted swans and golden chandeliers, a king paces alone. He has ruled Bavaria for 22 years. He has built 3 impossible palaces. He has spent more money than his kingdom possesses on visions only he can fully see. In 48 hours, Ludwig will be dead. His body will be found floating in the shallow waters of Lake Starnberg. The official verdict: suicide by drowning. But the lake was barely waist deep. His doctor's corpse will be discovered nearby. Scratch marks will be found on the doctor's face. No autopsy will be performed on the king. The mystery has never been solved, but the castle survived. The fantasy outlasted the man who dreamed it. Within weeks of Ludwig's death, the Bavarian government opened Neuschwanstein to paying visitors. They needed the money. The king had nearly bankrupted the state treasury. Tourists came by the thousands, then by the millions. Today, Neuschwanstein is the most visited castle in Europe. Over 1.4 million people walk through its gates every year. Its silhouette inspired the Sleeping Beauty Castle at Disneyland. Its image has appeared on postcards, puzzles, and posters in almost every country on Earth. A castle built for one man's private escape became one of the most public buildings in the world. How did a shy, eccentric king create something so enduring? What drove him to pour his fortune and his sanity into stone and gold? And what really happened in those final hours when the dream collapsed and the dreamer disappeared forever? To understand any of this, we need to go back to the beginning, to a boy who grew up in a cold castle, surrounded by stories of knights and swans, a boy who would become king before he was ready, and who would spend his life trying to build a world where the stories were real. Ludwig was born on August 25, 1845 in Nymphenburg Palace outside Munich. His timing was symbolic. He arrived on the same date as his grandfather, Ludwig III, the king who had transformed Munich into a city of grand boulevards and neoclassical architecture. The coincidence was seen as an omen. This child would continue the family legacy of building. No one could have predicted how literally that would come true. His childhood was not happy. His father, Maximilian II, was a serious man devoted to scholarship and duty. Affection was rationed, discipline was constant. Ludwig and his younger brother Otto were raised according to strict schedules. Up at 5 in the morning, cold baths, hours of lessons, limited meals, punishments for the smallest infractions. The princes slept in unheated rooms. Their toys were few. Their father believed hardship built character. Ludwig escaped the only way he could, into stories. The castle where he spent his summers, Hohenschwangau, became his refuge. It was a medieval fortress that his father had restored in the Romantic style, filled with murals depicting German legends, knights in armor, swan maidens, the Holy Grail. One legend dominated the walls, the story of Lohengrin, the Swan Knight. In the tale, a mysterious knight arrives in a boat drawn by a swan to defend a falsely accused princess. He marries her, but on one condition: she must never ask his true name or origin. When she breaks the vow, Lohengrin must leave forever. The swan returns. The knight departs. Love cannot survive the intrusion of reality. Young Ludwig was captivated. He spent hours staring at the murals, memorizing every detail. He staged elaborate plays with his brother, casting himself as the knight, the king, the hero of impossible quests. He read everything he could find about the medieval world. Not the real medieval world of plague and poverty, but the romantic version. Castles in the clouds, pure-hearted monarchs, a time when kings were sacred. His father noticed the boys dreaming and disapproved. Ludwig was meant to be a modern monarch, practical and politically shrewd. The 19th century demanded efficiency, not fantasy. Steam engines were reshaping Europe. Revolutions had toppled thrones. A king who lost himself in legends would not survive. But Ludwig could not stop. When he was 15, something happened that sealed his fate. He attended a performance of Richard Wagner's opera, Lohengrin, at the Munich Court Theater. The experience overwhelmed him. Here was everything he had imagined made real through music. The Swan Night, the sacred mystery, the tragedy of a soul too pure for the ordinary world. Ludwig wept. He returned to see the opera again and again. Wagner became his obsession. The composer was controversial, brilliant, perpetually in debt, and on the run from creditors across Europe. His operas were revolutionary, demanding orchestras of unprecedented size and stages that could create impossible effects. He dreamed of a theater devoted entirely to his work, where art would become a religious experience. Ludwig understood. He had found someone whose visions matched his own, but he was just a prince. He had no power to help. That changed on March 10, 1864. King Maximilian II died suddenly of an undiagnosed illness. Ludwig was 18 years old. Overnight, he became King Ludwig II of Bavaria. He was not ready. The new king was tall and strikingly handsome, with dark hair and intense eyes. He was also painfully shy, prone to long silences, uncomfortable in crowds. He had been educated in philosophy and art, but barely trained in governance. His ministers found him distracted, unpredictable, more interested in discussing Wagner than debating treaties. His first act as king revealed everything. Ludwig sent a royal messenger to find Richard Wagner, who was hiding from creditors in Stuttgart. The messenger carried a photograph of the young king and a ring. The message was simple: come to Munich. All your debts will be paid. All your operas will be performed. You will have everything you need. Wagner thought it was a joke or a trap. It was neither. Ludwig was offering the composer exactly what he promised: unlimited patronage, royal friendship, the chance to build the theatrical revolution Wagner had only dreamed about. Wagner came to Munich. Ludwig paid off debts that amounted to a small fortune. He provided a house, a salary, and complete artistic freedom. The king attended rehearsals, spent hours discussing music and mythology, and poured money into productions of Wagner's work. For a brief moment, king and composer created something extraordinary together, but the partnership would soon face opposition, and Ludwig would begin searching for something else, a place of his own, a castle where the dreams could never be interrupted, a place that would cost him everything. The idea crystallized slowly. Ludwig had seen Neuschwanstein, his father's romantic restoration, and found it beautiful but borrowed, someone else's vision. He had attended Wagner's operas and felt the power of total artistic environments, where every detail served the emotional effect. He wanted to combine both: a castle that was entirely his own creation, a stage set made permanent in stone. The location came first. Above Neuschwanstein, on a rugged outcrop called the Jugend, stood the ruins of two medieval fortresses. The sight was dramatic almost beyond belief. Sheer cliffs dropped to the valley below. The Alps rose behind in jagged white peaks. Forests carpeted the slopes. On clear days, you could see 4 lakes shimmering in the distance. Ludwig climbed the ruins often as a young man. He knew every rock, every vista, every angle of light. In 1868, he made his decision. The old ruins would be demolished. In their place would rise something unprecedented, a castle that looked medieval but functioned with modern technology, a monument to the legends he loved, built with the engineering of the industrial age. He wrote to Wagner describing his vision. The letter survives. I intend to rebuild the old castle ruins of Hohenschwangau near the Pellet Gorge in the genuine style of the old German knights' castles. The location is one of the most beautiful to be found, sacred and unapproachable, a worthy temple for the Divine Friend. The Divine Friend was Wagner. The castle would be a shrine to the composer's work. Every room would depict scenes from the operas. Every corridor would echo with legend. But the design process revealed something Wagner himself might not have anticipated. Ludwig's vision was not simply homage, it was replacement. The king didn't just want to celebrate Wagner's art, he wanted to inhabit it, to become the characters, to live inside the myth. The architects struggled to keep up. Eduard Riedel was the first, a respected Munich architect who drew the initial plans. But Riedel thought in terms of function and structure. Ludwig thought in terms of emotion and symbol. The king rejected designs that were too practical, too modern, too much like real buildings. He wanted a fairy tale. The solution came from an unusual source. Christian Jank was not an architect, but a theatrical set designer. He had created backdrops for the Munich Court Theater, including productions of Wagner's operas. He understood how to make the impossible look real. Ludwig commissioned Jank to paint the castle as it should appear, not floor plans and elevations, but romantic visions. Towers reaching toward the sky, walls emerging from cliffs as if grown there, a composition of masses and silhouettes designed to take the breath away. These paintings became the true blueprints. The architects were then tasked with making Jank's fantasies structurally possible. It was like asking engineers to build a dream. Construction began in September 1869. The challenges were immediate and immense. The site sat at nearly 3,000 feet elevation. No roads led there. Every stone, every beam, every pane of glass had to be hauled up the mountain by horse and cart, or hoisted by crane up the cliff face. Water was pumped from 200 meters below. A steam crane, unprecedented for castle construction, lifted materials to the upper levels. The technology was cutting edge. The appearance was medieval. This tension would define everything about Neuschwanstein. The workforce grew to hundreds of men, stonemasons from across Bavaria, carpenters, metalworkers, painters and gilders, specialists in every decorative art. They lived in temporary barracks on the mountain, working 6 days a week through alpine winters and brief summers. The construction site operated like a small city. Forges produced iron fittings on location. Workshops shaped wood into elaborate carvings. A narrow-gauge railway carried stone from the valley to the lower slopes. Ludwig visited constantly. He arrived at night, by torchlight, to inspect progress without being seen by crowds of workers. He climbed scaffolding to check details. He demanded changes that added months and fortunes to the project. A window was wrong. Move it 3 feet. The tower proportions needed adjustment. Tear it down and rebuild. The stone color must be lighter. Source different quarries. Each change meant delay. Each delay meant cost. But the king had stopped counting. The exterior began to take shape by the early 1870s. The main gate, house rose first, completed enough for Ludwig to stay there during visits. Then the square tower. Then the great palace, the residential building that would contain the most important rooms. From the valley below, travelers could see something extraordinary emerging, a white vision against the mountain, towers and walls that seemed to belong to another century, another world. They couldn't see what was hidden inside the walls, the innovations that made the fantasy functional. Central heating through hot air ducts built into the masonry, running water on every floor, heated by a coal-fired system. flush toilets, a rarity even in royal residences, electric call bells that would allow Ludwig to summon servants from anywhere in the building. The kitchen was placed on the ground floor, connected to the dining room 3 stories above by a dumbwaiter system that kept food hot during transport. Speaking tubes carried Ludwig's voice to servants' quarters without requiring him to see anyone. Because that was the other truth about Neuschwanstein. Ludwig was building a castle for complete solitude. The first rooms opened to Ludwig in 1873. He moved into the completed sections of the gatehouse while construction continued around him. Scaffolding still wrapped the palace. The sound of hammers echoed through the gorge. Dust clouded the air. None of it mattered. Ludwig was home. The interior design had consumed him for years. Every surface, every textile, every piece of furniture was specified in exhaustive detail. The king worked with teams of painters, sculptors, and craftsmen, rejecting designs that didn't match his vision, demanding revisions that pushed artisans to their limits. The results were unlike anything Europe had seen. The throne room occupied the western end of the palace, rising through 2 full stories. The inspiration was Byzantine. Ludwig had become fascinated with absolute monarchy, with the idea of divine kingship. The Byzantine emperors had combined religious and royal authority into one sacred office. His throne room would embody that fusion. The walls were covered in elaborate murals depicting Christ, the apostles, and 6 canonized kings. Gold leaf caught the light from arched windows. A massive chandelier, shaped like a Byzantine crown, hung from the vaulted ceiling. It weighed over 2 tons and held 96 candles. The floor was a mosaic of over 2 million stones, depicting plants and animals in intricate patterns. Workers spent years on their knees setting each piece. The apse where the throne would stand was modeled on a church sanctuary. Steps of white Carrara marble led upward. The canopy above was painted blue with golden stars, like the vault of heaven. But there was no throne. The elaborate platform, the stairs, the golden canopy, all prepared for a seat that was never installed. Ludwig planned a throne of gold and ivory, but died before it could be completed. The space remains empty today, a stage without its final actor. From the throne room, Ludwig could retreat to his private apartments. The royal bedroom was a Gothic fantasy in blue and gold. The bed sat beneath a carved oak canopy, so elaborate that 14 wood carvers spent 4.5 years creating it. Columns twisted upward to support a peaked roof studded with finials and spires. The effect was a cathedral in miniature, with the king's sleeping form as the sacred relic. The walls depicted the legend of Tristan and Isolde, the doomed lovers from Wagner's opera. Blue silk covered every surface not occupied by murals. A small oratory allowed Ludwig to pray without leaving his bedroom. A secret door led to a tiny study where he read late into the night. The reading desk faced a window with views across the Alps. The dressing room continued the Tristan theme, with murals showing the knight's arrival, his love, and his death. The singer's hall, though called a hall, was actually 2 stories high, lined with paintings depicting the legend of Parsifal and the Holy Grail. Acoustically, the space was designed for performance, but no performance ever occurred. Ludwig intended the hall for his imagination alone. He would sit in the vast room, surrounded by images of Grail knights and forest hermits, listening to music only he could hear. The grotto was the strangest space of all. Connecting the dressing room to the study, Ludwig created an artificial cave. The walls were shaped to resemble a natural cavern, with stalactites hanging from the ceiling. A small waterfall splashed into a pool. Hidden lighting, first gas, later electric, could change color, casting the space in blue, red, or gold. The grotto recreated a scene from Wagner's Tannhäuser, where the knight visits the underground realm of Venus. Ludwig would sometimes have the pool filled with heated water and float there in a shell-shaped boat, surrounded by artificial moonlight. The technology required for this effect was extraordinary. Water had to be pumped and heated. Colored glass slides rotated before the lamps. The entire space was waterproofed using techniques borrowed from industrial engineering, all for a king who wanted to float alone in a fake cave. The contradictions multiplied throughout the castle. The kitchen was equipped with the most modern appliances available: coal-fired ranges that could prepare meals for dozens, mechanical spits, copper pots in every size, speaking tubes connected to the dining room above. The dumbwaiter ran on a sophisticated pulley system. But Ludwig almost always dined alone. His single place setting would ascend through the ceiling, appearing on a table already laid. The servants remained below, invisible. The king ate surrounded by paintings of medieval feasts, entirely by himself. The servants' quarters revealed the hidden machinery of the fantasy. Behind the decorated rooms ran a parallel world of plain corridors and functional spaces. Staff moved through these passages, maintaining the illusion of a castle where everything happened by magic. They stoked the boilers that heated the building. They filled the oil lamps and later maintained the electrical systems. They carried water and removed waste. Their quarters were comfortable but modest: simple beds, shared dining facilities. The contrast with the royal apartments was absolute. A few yards of stone wall separated splendor from service. The servants were under strict orders. They must not be seen unless summoned. They must not speak unless spoken to. They must maintain the fantasy that Ludwig lived in solitary perfection, needing nothing from the ordinary world. At night, when the work crews had left and the servants had withdrawn, Ludwig would walk through his creation. He kept nocturnal hours, sleeping through the day and waking after sunset. The castle was lit by thousands of candles, their light reflecting off gold leaf and polished surfaces. The shadows animated the murals. The painted knights seemed to move. Ludwig sometimes dressed in historical costumes. He would enter the singers' hall in the robes of a Grail knight. He would sit in the dining room dressed as a medieval king, eating from golden plates while invisible servants replenished his wine. He was performing for an audience of none, or perhaps for an audience of ghosts, the legends he loved, the characters who felt more real to him than the ministers and diplomats who demanded his attention in Munich. Because that was the truth Ludwig was trying to escape. He was still king. Bavaria still existed. The kingdom had problems that wouldn't go away no matter how high he built his walls. And the bills were coming due. While Neuschwanstein rose on its mountain, Bavaria changed around it. Ludwig had inherited a kingdom that prided itself on independence. For centuries, Bavaria had maintained its own army, its own laws, its own diplomatic relationships. The Wittelsbach dynasty had ruled since 1180. They answered to no one. But Prussia was rising. Otto von Bismarck, the Prussian chancellor, was systematically unifying the German states under Prussian leadership. He used diplomacy when possible and war when necessary. In 1866, Prussia defeated Austria and its German allies, including Bavaria, in a swift summer campaign. Bavaria was forced to sign a military alliance with Prussia. Ludwig had watched his army march to defeat. He hated the Prussians. He hated Bismarck. He especially hated the idea that Bavaria might lose its independence, but he was powerless to prevent it. In 1870, Bismarck engineered a war with France. Bavaria was obligated by treaty to fight alongside Prussia. Ludwig's soldiers marched again, this time to victory. The French Empire collapsed. Paris was besieged and starved. In the aftermath, Bismarck arranged his masterpiece. The German states would unite into a single empire, with the Prussian king as German emperor. Bavaria would join or face the consequences. Ludwig faced an impossible choice. His kingdom could not stand alone against a united Germany. Resistance meant war, Occupation? Perhaps the end of the Wittelsbach dynasty entirely. But accepting unification meant reducing himself to a subordinate, a junior partner in Bismarck's creation. Bismarck offered compensation if Ludwig would write a letter inviting the Prussian king to accept the imperial crown, making the offer appear voluntary rather than coerced. Prussia would provide financial support, a personal payment to Ludwig, secret money, untraceable, to fund whatever projects the king desired. Ludwig wrote the letter. His hand shook as he signed it. In January 1871, the German Empire was proclaimed in the Hall of Mirrors at Versailles. The Prussian king became Kaiser Wilhelm I. Bavaria became a state within the empire, retaining some privileges but losing true independence. Ludwig refused to attend the ceremony. He stayed in Munich, humiliated, while his foreign minister represented Bavaria at the event that ended 7 centuries of Wittelsbach sovereignty. The secret payments began flowing. Historians estimate that Bismarck's government ultimately transferred several million marks to Ludwig's personal accounts. The money was meant to purchase continued cooperation. Ludwig used it for something else entirely. He used it to build, not just Neuschwanstein, but 2 other palaces that consumed his imagination. Linderhof, a Rococo fantasy inspired by Versailles, and Herrenchiemsee, an actual copy of Versailles, built on an island in a Bavarian lake. 3 impossible projects running simultaneously. Thousands of workers, mountains of materials, decorative schemes of unprecedented elaboration. The Bismarck money was gone almost immediately. Ludwig began borrowing, first from Bavarian banks, using his personal income as collateral, then from international lenders who saw an opportunity in a king's desperation. The interest compounded, the debts multiplied. The Bavarian cabinet watched with growing alarm. Ludwig's personal expenditures were technically his own affair, funded from the civil list, the annual payment the state provided for royal expenses. The civil list was generous, around 4 million marks per year. For most monarchs, it was more than sufficient. Ludwig was spending 10 times that amount. When the civil list was exhausted, he demanded advances from future years. When advances ran out, he commanded his ministers to find new sources of funds. He proposed selling off royal properties. He considered pawning the crown jewels. His ministers resisted. They tried to explain that even a king could not spend money that didn't exist. Ludwig refused to understand. He was convinced that enemies were conspiring against him, that his rightful resources were being stolen, that if only he could get past the petty bureaucrats, infinite funds would appear. The construction never stopped. The workers still climbed the mountain every morning. The craftsmen still gilded and carved and painted. The bills still arrived. By the early 1880s, Ludwig's personal debts approached 14 million marks. The Bavarian government was technically not responsible, but the scandal was becoming impossible to contain. Creditors wrote letters that ministers had to answer. Rumors circulated through the European press. The king was mad. The king was bankrupt. The king was destroying his kingdom. Meanwhile, Ludwig withdrew further into his creations. He visited Munich less and less. He conducted government business through written notes, refusing to meet ministers in person. He reversed his sleep schedule entirely, rising at midnight and retiring at dawn. He took long solitary drives through the mountains in the middle of the night, his carriage moving through darkness while the kingdom slept. His coachmen called them ghost rides. Ludwig sometimes stopped his carriage at peasant homes, knocking on doors at 2 a.m. to request a glass of milk. The farmers, terrified and confused, complied. Who refuses a king? He dressed in elaborate costumes. He set extra places at dinner for the ghosts of Louis XIV and Marie Antoinette, speaking to the empty chairs as if the French monarchs were present. He gained weight. His teeth rotted. His handsome face coarsened, and he continued to demand more construction, more spending, more fantasy made real. as if building faster could outrun the collapse that was coming. The Bavarian cabinet began meeting in secret. They were loyal subjects, but they were also practical men. The king's behavior was becoming impossible to manage. His debts threatened the kingdom's credit. His refusal to conduct normal governance left the state paralyzed. Something had to be done. They began considering an idea that had never been attempted in Bavarian history: removing a king from power, not by revolution, not by abdication, but by declaring him insane. The conspiracy came together in the spring of 1886. Johann von Lutz, Ludwig's chief minister, was the organizer. He had served the king for years, attempting to manage the chaos of Ludwig's reign. He was exhausted. The creditors were circling. The newspapers were filled with humiliating stories. Something had to change. Lutz approached the royal family quietly. Prince Luitpold, Ludwig's uncle, was the next in line after Ludwig's brother Otto. But Otto had been confined for years, suffering from what doctors then called insanity, likely schizophrenia in modern terms. He would never be able to rule. That left Luitpold as regent, an older, practical man who would restore order and respectability. If Ludwig could be removed, the method was straightforward. Bavarian law allowed for a ruling monarch to be deposed if proven mentally incapable. All that was required was medical certification of insanity, followed by a formal government action. Lutz gathered a team of doctors. The lead physician was Bernhard von Gudden, one of Germany's most prominent psychiatrists. Gudden had treated Otto and was familiar with the Wittelsbach family's history of mental instability. He was asked to prepare a report on Ludwig's mental state, but there was a problem. Gudden never examined Ludwig. The king refused to see doctors. He refused to submit to any evaluation. Gudden was forced to prepare his diagnosis from a distance, based on testimony from servants, reports from ministers, and the king's own increasingly erratic letters. The resulting document was remarkable. Gudden concluded that Ludwig suffered from paranoia, rendering him permanently incapable of ruling. He cited the nocturnal habits, the refusal to conduct business, the elaborate fantasy world, the wild spending. Each item added weight to the diagnosis. Modern psychiatrists have questioned the report for over a century. Many of Gudden's criteria, social withdrawal, unconventional hours, obsessive interests, are not by themselves evidence of psychosis. Some scholars argue Ludwig was eccentric, possibly depressive, perhaps on the autism spectrum, none of which would have justified removing him from the throne. But in 1886, Gudden's word was sufficient. On June 9th, a commission arrived at Neuschwanstein to deliver the verdict. Ludwig was officially declared insane. His government had deposed him. Prince Luitpold would rule as regent. Ludwig was to be taken into custody. The first attempt failed. Local police, loyal to the king, turned the commission away at the castle gates. For a few hours, Ludwig seemed to have support. He issued orders for the arrest of the commissioners. He sent messages to Munich demanding loyalty, but the messages were intercepted. The cabinet controlled the telegraph lines, the post, the railways. Ludwig was isolated on his mountain, cut off from anyone who might help. On June 11th, Gudden led a second commission. This time, there was no resistance. The gendarmes had received orders from Munich. The gates opened. Gudden walked through the courtyards Ludwig had designed, past the murals and the fountains, up the stairs to the royal apartments. He found the king awake. Ludwig was dressed and calm. He had expected this moment. He asked only for time to say goodbye to his castle. Gudden agreed. The king walked through his creation one final time. The unfinished rooms, the painted legends, the throne room with its empty platform, the bedroom where he had dreamed alone for years. Then he submitted to arrest. The party left Neuschwanstein at 4 a.m. on June 12th. Ludwig sat in a closed carriage, Gudden beside him. Their destination was Berg Castle on Lake Starnberg, a smaller residence that had been prepared as a comfortable prison. Ludwig looked out the carriage window as Neuschwanstein disappeared behind the trees. He never saw it again. Berg Castle was less a prison than a gilded cage. Ludwig was given comfortable rooms overlooking Lake Starnberg. Guards patrolled outside. The doors were locked, but not brutally. The intention was humane custody, not punishment. Gudden stayed on as Ludwig's personal physician. He was confident in his diagnosis and oddly relaxed about the arrangements. The king seemed calm, resigned even. The transition appeared to be going smoothly. On June 13th, Ludwig asked to take a walk in the castle grounds. Gudden agreed. The king had been cooperative. A walk would do him good. The psychiatrist decided to accompany Ludwig personally, without guards. He wanted to observe his patient in a relaxed setting. They left Berg Castle at approximately 6 p.m., walking toward the lakeshore. No one knows exactly what happened next. The two men walked along the edge of the water. At some point, they entered the lake itself. The water was shallow, barely thigh-deep along most of the shore. Not a place where a healthy man could accidentally drown. When they didn't return by 8 p.m., search parties were sent. Ludwig's body was found floating in the lake around 10:30 p.m. His watch had stopped at 6:54. Gudden's body was discovered nearby. Both men were dead. Gudden's face showed scratch marks. His fingernails were broken. There had been a struggle. The official verdict was suicide. Ludwig had thrown himself into the water to drown. Gudden had tried to save him and died in the attempt. Few believed it then. Few believe it now. The lake was too shallow for drowning. Ludwig was a strong swimmer. Gudden, in his 60s and much smaller than the king, could not have struggled so violently against a man who was simply drowning himself. Alternative theories multiplied immediately. Some believed Ludwig was murdered by his own government. He had been making threats from Neuschwanstein, promising to expose Bismarck's secret payments, to appeal directly to the Bavarian people. Perhaps the cabinet decided that a dead king was less dangerous than a living one. Others believed Ludwig was shot. An eyewitness in a nearby village later claimed to have heard gunshots. When Ludwig's coat was examined, it reportedly showed bullet holes. The coat later disappeared from the royal archives. Some believed Ludwig tried to escape. He may have arranged for a boat to meet him on the lake. When the plan failed, he was killed either by Gudden or by other agents. The truth died with the two men in the water. Ludwig was buried in the Michaelskirche in Munich. His heart, following Wittelsbach tradition, was placed in a silver urn and interred at the Altötting shrine. The funeral drew enormous crowds. Whatever the circumstances of his death, Ludwig had been king for 22 years. Many Bavarians remembered him with genuine affection. He had been strange, yes, but also generous, building projects that employed thousands, maintaining the cultural institutions his father had endowed. His castles remained behind. Linderhof was complete. Herrenchiemsee was half finished. Neuschwanstein was perhaps 2/3 done, with major rooms still lacking their final decoration. The Bavarian government, now led by Prince Luitpold as regent, faced an immediate question: what to do with the buildings Ludwig had nearly bankrupted the kingdom to create. The answer came quickly. Within 7 weeks of Ludwig's death, Neuschwanstein opened to the public. Admission was charged. The proceeds went directly to paying off the royal debts. Tourists flooded in. They came to see the throne room with its golden mosaics. They came to gaze at the bedroom with its carved canopy. They came to walk the corridors lined with murals of legends they half remembered from childhood. They came, most of all, because the story was irresistible. A king who built a fairy tale, a fantasy so consuming it destroyed him. And now, anyone for the price of a ticket could walk inside the dream. The castle never stopped drawing crowds. Through 2 world wars, through revolution and occupation, through the fall of the German Empire and the rise and collapse of the Third Reich, Neuschwanstein, remained standing. American soldiers captured it in 1945 and found Nazi treasure hidden in the lower rooms, stolen artworks awaiting recovery. The building itself was unharmed. By the 1950s, Neuschwanstein had become one of Germany's premier tourist destinations. Visitors from around the world climbed the mountain to see Ludwig's vision. The numbers grew every decade. Then Walt Disney visited. The exact date is debated. Some sources place Disney at Neuschwanstein in the early 1950s, during a European trip that included scouting for inspiration. Others suggest he knew the castle only from photographs and film. What's certain is the influence. When Disney designed Sleeping Beauty Castle for his new theme park in California, the silhouette was unmistakable. The white towers rising in stepped tiers, the clustered roof lines and pointed spires, the way the castle composed into a single dramatic image from the approach. Disneyland opened in 1955. The castle became the icon of the park, appearing in every logo and advertisement. When Walt Disney World opened in Florida in 1971, Cinderella Castle continued the theme, different in detail but carrying the same romantic DNA. Ludwig's fantasy, built for solitary contemplation, became the symbol of mass entertainment. The irony would not have amused him. Or perhaps it would? Ludwig had understood the power of architecture to transport, to convince, to create an emotional reality more vivid than the everyday world. He had simply never imagined sharing that power with millions. Today, Neuschwanstein receives over 1.4 million visitors per year. In peak summer months, 6,000 people per day climb the mountain. They arrive by bus, by taxi, by foot from the village of Hohenschwangau far below. They wait in lines that can stretch for hours. They take guided tours lasting 35 minutes, moving in groups through the completed rooms. They photograph everything: the throne room, the grotto, the views from the Singers' Hall, the bed where Ludwig slept alone beneath its Gothic canopy. They buy souvenirs in the shop that occupies the lower courtyard: postcards, keychains, snow globes, replicas of the castle in every size and material. Neuschwanstein as capitalism, as brand, as infinitely reproducible image. Ludwig would have been horrified. He built the castle specifically to escape such intrusions. He wanted a world sealed against the public, a sanctuary where only he could enter. The servants were hidden precisely because their presence would remind him that the fantasy required support, labor, the messy infrastructure of real life. Now the infrastructure is the experience. Tour guides explain the heating system, the kitchens, the clever technology that made the medieval appearance possible. The hidden passages are part of the tour. Nothing is private anymore, yet something of Ludwig's intention survives. Visitors still gasp when they enter the throne room. They still fall silent in the Singers' Hall, looking up at murals that glow with gold and lapis blue. They still feel, however briefly, the pull of the fantasy, the wish for a world more beautiful and coherent than the one outside. That pull is why they came. That pull is why they keep coming. Ludwig created something that transcends its origins. He built for his own obsessive needs, using his own peculiar mixture of nostalgia and technology, legend and engineering. And somehow the result speaks to people who share none of his circumstances, none of his wounds, none of his specific dreams. They recognize the longing, the wish for escape, the hunger for beauty that follows its own rules, the hope that somewhere, in some high castle hidden in the mountains, the world makes sense. Neuschwanstein promises that place exists. For 35 minutes, you can walk through it. Then you descend the mountain and return to ordinary life. But you remember, the throne room stands empty. Over a century and a half after Ludwig first imagined it, The platform at the top of the marble stairs holds nothing. No golden throne, no ivory inlays, no velvet cushion where a king might sit. The space was prepared for an object that never arrived. Ludwig died before the throne could be commissioned. His successors saw no reason to complete it. Why install a throne for a king who was dead in a building that now belonged to tourists? The absence feels deliberate now, a reminder that the fantasy was never quite finished. That Ludwig's vision, magnificent as it was, always fell just short of the dream that drove it. He wanted to be a medieval king. He built rooms that looked like medieval chambers, but the technology behind the walls was relentlessly modern. The heating ducts, the plumbing, the call bells. The fantasy depended on the very industrial age Ludwig despised. He wanted solitude. He designed a castle where he could be utterly alone, but he needed hundreds of workers to build it, dozens of servants to maintain it, and eventually millions of tourists to pay for it. He wanted escape. He found it for a while, walking through his painted halls at midnight, dressed in historical costume, speaking to ghosts. But the kingdom followed him up the mountain. The debts, the conspiracies, the pressure of a world that would not leave him alone. In the end, the lake took him. Shallow water, a mystery never solved. A king who built a fairy tale and drowned in reality. The castle survived because it had to. The debts demanded it. The tourists came and kept coming, and Neuschwanstein transformed from private dream to public spectacle. But stand in the throne room today, when the tour group has moved on and the space falls silent. Look up at the mosaic ceiling, the painted saints, the golden chandelier holding its weight of unlit candles. Something remains. Not Ludwig's presence exactly, not his madness or his loneliness, but the intensity of his wanting, the absolute conviction that a building could become a world, that walls and ceilings and decorated surfaces could hold meaning dense enough to live inside. He was wrong about many things. He was wrong about money, about politics, about the possibility of retreat from modern life. But he was not wrong about the power of architecture to move us. Neuschwanstein still moves people, even now, even surrounded by crowds and gift shops and tour schedules. The silhouette against the Alps still catches the breath. The painted rooms still shimmer with gold. Ludwig built it for himself. The world made it their own. Whether that's tragedy or transformation depends on how you look at it. The throne room waits. The stairs lead upward to emptiness. And somewhere in that emptiness, in the space where a golden seat was never placed, the fantasy continues. A king who built a dream that outlasted the king. The castle on the mountain, waiting for whoever climbs next.